Good morning, Mr. Noche. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, Chairperson.
Are we ready?
Chairperson, we are ready to start. This is a hearing of the Bosasa stream. And this hearing today is as a result of Mr. Cedric Frolick. He applied after he had the evidence of Mr. Agrizi, and after he had been served with 3 notices, he applied for permission to file an affidavit and testify. He has now filed an affidavit, and today he is testifying in respect of those. He filed 2 affidavits, and then in August, he filed a 3rd affidavit, which deals with only specific witnesses. Chair, as the application and the affidavits are in a bundle, Bosasa bundle, and it's Bosasa bundle 3. And then the affidavit, the application and the accompanying affidavits, we mark them as Exhibit T17, but then the separate affidavits, they have sub-17 number to be T17.1.2.3 as we go along.
You have said too many things, Mr. Noche.
Yes. Okay, let me start with the first one. The first one is today the file before you.
There is Bosasa Bundle 03.
Yes.
That has got Mr. Frolick's affidavit. According to what has been written on the spine, it is proposed that what is inside the file would be exhibits. Exhibit what? T17.
Yes.
Which file do you want me to have here? Is it this one I have, or is it another one?
Is that file only?
Yeah, let's just deal with that one for now. It's Bosasa Bundle 03.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Can the witness then be sworn in?
Yes, let counsel for Mr. Frolick place himself on record first. You can do it from where you are.
May I remain seated?
Yes, yes.
Chairperson, name is Francois van Zyl, SC, member of the Cape Bar. I represent Mr. Frolick in these proceedings on instructions from Dani House Incorporated. My instructing attorney is not here for cost-saving purposes.
Yes. Yes.
We are prepared to give evidence.
Yes.
He has previously applied
yes.
to give evidence. You gave him permission to give evidence, and that
yes.
is why we are here today.
Yes. No,
there's one correction I have to make.
Yes.
I wonder if I shouldn't make it now.
Okay, make it now so we get it out of the way.
If you can go in Exhibit T17 to page 34, paragraph 12.
Page 34.
3-4.
Okay, you're using the black numbers, eh?
I'm using the black numbers left top.
Okay. Yes.
Paragraph 12. The last sentence, first last line reads, travel arrangements were managed by EPRU office. I only subsequently learned in a discussion with Cheeky Watson during Mr. Agrizi's evidence that Blake's Travel was a travel service provider to the EPRU. That should read to Bosasa, not the EPRU to Bosasa.
Okay. I think what will be necessary is later on from Mr. Frolick to just do 2 lines, 1 line supplementary affidavit to correct that.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
And may I also draw your attention to the fact that we have yesterday been sent a whole bundle of cell phone records. I only received it when I arrived in Johannesburg, and we only had very little time yesterday evening, yesterday afternoon late, to look at it. It was virtually impossible, of course, it's a spreadsheet, and the computer only shows half the page. It was very difficult. But Mr. Frolick looked at it, and he is prepared to answer questions as best he can.
Yes.
If he has a problem, he will tell
He
you,
will say so.
and then we'll have to take it from there.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, Mr. Noche. I think then please administer the oath of affirmation.
Please state your full names for the record.
Cedric Thomas Frolick?
Do you have any objection taking the prescribed affirmation?
No.
Do you solemnly affirm that the evidence you will give shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing else but the truth? If so, please raise your right hand and say, I truly affirm.
I fully affirm.
Thank you very much. You may be seated, Mr. Frolick.
Now, Mr. Frolick, I'm sure you, before we started, I showed you the record, and then let me put it on record that we are using, when we refer to page numbers, we are using the black numbers. You see it's called Bosasa -3, and then dash, then there'll be a number. That's the page number we're referring to. You understand? You understand, Mr. Frolick? Now, Mr. Frolick,
If you agree, nodding won't be enough because the recording won't capture that. So you need to say yes so that it's recorded.
My apologies,
Yes.
Deputy Chief Justice.
Okay.
I agree.
Now, Mr. Frolick, can I take you to page 8, that is the black page 8? And there you see an affidavit. It's a document called affidavit, and it says, I, the undersigned, Cedric Thomas Frolick. You see that?
We're on page 8 now.
Page 8?
Did you say page 8?
Page 8, yes.
Oh,
Okay, I've got the page.
Are you on the page?
Yes.
You see the document named affidavit, and then Cedric Thomas Frolick. You see that?
I see that.
Then go to page 12.
Mr. Noche, I'm sorry I'm interrupting you. Do take note that that affidavit is just a condemnation affidavit only.
Yes, no, I'm just putting it on the record.
Well, why do we need a condemnation affidavit?
Well, the
That's-
document is,
We've passed that stage, isn't it?
yes, I'm not going to lead on it, but just putting it on record as it's.
I thought you'd go to his substantive affidavit, the one where he tells his story.
No, that's fine. Then, just in passing, Mr. Frolick, can you go to page 31? There's an affidavit, and then can you go to page 42?
I'm on page 42.
Yes, there is a signature above the name CT Frolick. Is that your signature?
That's correct.
You confirm that this is your affidavit?
Correct.
Chair, can this affidavit of Mr. Frolick, then on page 31, just a minute. Yes, I'm just looking at the exhibit number. It's exhibit 17.4. Yes. T17.4. No, Chair, sorry, I beg your pardon. Chair. It's-
Where is
No, I beg your pardon,
17.1?
it's 17.3.
Or where will be 17.1?
17.1 is the index to the application. 17.4 is the affidavit, which is the application affidavit. Then 17.3,
Is 17.1 meant to be the condemnation affidavit?
yes.
Okay,
Condemnation application. 17.2 is a supporting affidavit.
Well, let's do it, even though we don't really need it, if that's already what's in the index. But otherwise, the condemnation thing is something of the past. We don't need it anymore. Okay. So we start at page 8.
Let's go back, Mr. Frolick, can we go back to page 8 where
I'm on page 8.
and then if you turn to page, hold on page 8, turn to page 12. Is that your signature on page 12?
That's correct.
Do you confirm that this is your affidavit?
I do confirm.
Yes. Chair, can this be admitted as 17.2?
Is there a T before 17?
TT 17.2.
T 17.2.
Yes.
And where is point 1, 17.1?
17.1 is the notice of motion.
Yeah, let's do that, because now when they prepare the record, there'll be a problem where they can see 17.2, but they don't know where 17.1 is. So we may as well-
17.1 starts, Chair, at 04, page 04.
Yeah, but we don't need to do the index. I think we should start at 6, where the notice of motion starts, isn't it?
Well, the index forms part of the,
Why do they do that?
I do not know, Chair.
I'm not feeling, happy about the fact that I'm now going to admit as an exhibit a condemnation affidavit when condemnation is not an issue, when that's been dealt with some time back. But I was thinking not to mess up the index, maybe we may as well do that, but actually the condemnation affidavit is irrelevant.
But don't you need, for purpose of record, to say he applied for condonation?
No,
And-
that's been sorted out. Yeah, that's been sorted out. We don't need it for this. I've condoned. It ended there, you see. So
That's fine.
at this stage, we should be looking simply at the substantive issues.
That's fine.
Maybe let's just say, let's say it's okay, exhibit T 17.1 is the notice of motion. Is that right?
That's fine.
Yeah, let's just, for this, so that the pagination is not messed up, then the affidavit starting at page 8 will be exhibit T 17.2, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And that is together with its annexures.
Yes.
And then when is which one would be 17.3?
17.3 starts on page 31, I beg your pardon.
Mr. Frolick's affidavit that starts at page 31 will be admitted and marked as exhibit T 17.3.
Yes,
Okay. What else?
and then, Mr. Frolick, can we then take you to page 54? There's
Yes.
an affidavit there, Mr. Frolick, and the signature of that is on page
65.
Signatures on page 65.
As it confirmed.
You confirm that, Mr. President?
I'm still trying to get to page 64. Or 65, my apologies.
Chair, apparently the mask is not, is stopping the sound, is interfering with the sound.
It is not stopping, or
It is interfering with the sound of the witness.
Oh.
Uh,
So the transcribers,
Yes,
the
I've just
recording,
received a note.
they can't hear.
Yes,
Okay.
they can hear.
Mr. Frolick, what's your attitude to removing it while you are giving evidence?
Chairperson, I don't have any problem with it. However, in one of the correspondence that we communicated to this commission, I indicated that I tested positive for COVID-19
Yes,
and that I have recovered from that, but I'm still sitting with the after effects of
yes,
the impact that it had on my system. So with your permission, I'm prepared to remove the mask.
yes. No, I mean, from my side, and I'm sure from the side of everybody, one won't mind if you put it on as long as we can hear you and those who are recording are able to hear you. But if we can't hear you or those who are recording can't hear you, then we can't proceed because there needs to be a record. So, but I mean, I remember, I know what you are talking about. I know what you are talking about. I'm wondering whether if you raise your voice more, whether that might assist. Okay, let's try with him raising his voice more, and then we'll see whether we can hear in the first place,
Okay.
and then whether they can hear.
Chairperson, I'm prepared to remove the mask if you want to.
Well, I don't want you to feel uncomfortable, but
No.
that's why I was just saying,
Yeah, no, well-
if the bottom line is that we must hear you. I know that sometimes, I don't know whether certain masks enable people to be heard, even if they have them on, but others, you can't hear them. Yeah. Okay, no, that's all right then. Okay. Thank you.
Then, Mr. Frolick, we were on, I'd ask you to confirm on page 65 whether that signature is yours.
That's correct.
And then you confirm that this affidavit is your affidavit.
That's correct.
And Chair, can this then be marked T17.4?
Mr. Frolick's affidavit that starts at page 54 is admitted and will be marked as Exhibit T 17.4.
Yes.
Mhm.
Then, Chair, there was an affidavit which was filed by Mr. Gibson Jenje, Lizo Gibson Jenje. That affidavit has never been part of the record. But I'm of the view that this is the opportune time that to place it on record because it deals with this witness. The affidavit is on page 79.
Yes.
Can that be marked as Exhibit T17.6? T17.6.
Exhibit T 17.6.
0.6. Yeah, 0.6, yes.
Okay. Yes.
Chair, then on page 68, 68, the telephone records that my learned friend referred to,
Yes.
can those be admitted as T17.5?
Exhibit T 17.5, yes.
Chair, that is the housekeeping exercise. Can we then proceed?
Okay,
Mr. Frolick,
Jerry, I'm sorry to interrupt, as far as we doing
Yes.
housekeeping.
yes,
There's also a further affidavit
yes,
by Mr. Frolick
yes,
that was filed dealing with the affidavit of Mr. Brian Blake of Blake's Travel,
yes,
and with this affidavit of Mr. Njenje.
yes,
And attached to that affidavit
Yes.
is also an affidavit by Daniel John Watson, or Chigi Watson.
yes, yes.
I think it is important
Yes.
that also be placed before the Commission.
Yeah. Where are those two? Are they here?
we try to print them in the local
Yeah.
printer, but we find that it's too voluminous.
Oh,
But it's being brought up.
okay, okay. Okay, that's right.
And I must also put on record that they were kind enough to give me a copy of the affidavit, not the annexures, but the affidavit of Mr. Frolick.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so you'll raise the
When we get to that.
later on. Yes. Okay, all right.
Now, Mr. Frolick, is it correct that you, through your legal representatives, you applied for leave to file affidavits to the Commission?
That's correct, sir.
And that was your application to file an affidavit. You sought to respond to the evidence of Mr. Agrizi
That's correct.
and his affidavit.
Correct.
Now, you have filed the affidavit that we have referred to. Yeah.
I'm sorry, Mr. Noche. It might be good for the purpose of those who are listening or watching to first give a brief background to Mr. Frolick's evidence, because it starts with Mr. Agrizi giving certain evidence relating to him so that people can follow as you put questions to him. The gist of what Mr. Agrizi said in implicating him.
Chair, the evidence of Mr. Agrizi was to the effect that he was introduced to Mr. Frolick by Mr. Chigi Watson, the brother of the late Gavin Watson. And subsequent to that, they met, and Mr. Agrizi says then, Mr. Frolick visited the Bosasa complex and accompanied with a parliamentarian.
No, I'm sorry, Mr. Noche. I think the story starts with Mr. Agrizi saying Bosasa had certain challenges. There was negative publicity about them and their contracts with the Department of Correctional Services, and they had been trying to have meetings with Mr. Smith, who was chairperson of the Correctional Services Portfolio Committee in Parliament at the time, and Mr. Smith was not positive towards them, had a negative attitude towards them. They were not getting an appointment with him. And then at a certain stage, I think he says Mr. Chiki Watson or Mr. Gavin Watson told him about Mr. Frolick. And then
Mr.
blah,
Chiki
blah, blah.
Watson.
Yeah, so I think that's how it starts. Then you can continue.
And then they visited.
Yeah.
A visit was arranged for Mr. Frolick together with a parliamentarian, Mr. Buti Kompela, to the Bosasa Business Park, which was called Mohali Business Park. There was a meeting held where he was introduced, and then he says there, and then they discussed the issue of they discussed the issue of meeting Mr. Vincent Smith, and then at some stage, Mr. Gavin Watson excused himself and he went to his vault and he came with a bag, security bag, and later on he gave it to Mr. Frolick. And thereafter the meeting was arranged. There are details that Mr. Frolick came back to say Mr. Vincent Smith didn't receive the letter, but the upshot of that was that a meeting was arranged for Mr. Agrizi together with Mr. Njenje to see Mr. Vincent Smith in Cape Town in Parliament. They went and visited him. He said it was a short visit, and thereafter Mr. Frolick took them and they had lunch with him, and then they flew back. And then he says at some stage he was asked by Mr. Gavin Watson to take some money to Port Elizabeth, to the house of Mr. Valance Watson, wherein they waited there and Mr. Frolick arrived. There was a discussion about local politics, and then he also talked to Mr. Frolick. And thereafter, as they were leaving, Mr. Valance Watson gave the parcel of money to Mr. Frolick. And thereafter, there was also, because Bosasa was having a problem in Parliament, and they also wanted to meet Mr. Masuta, and who was at that stage the Minister of Justice and Correctional Services. An opportunity they saw was that there was going to be a political rally in Port Elizabeth where Mr. Masuta was going to attend. Then they arranged that Mr. Masuta must be accommodated at one of the houses owned by Valance Watson. And that happened, but Mr. Watson could not meet Mr. Masuta. And then another issue was Bosasa had a problem with the Department of Correctional Services because they had tendered. And their view was that they were the lowest tenderer, but despite that, they didn't win the tender. So they sought to challenge that tender. And Mr. Agrizi says he was at home sick, and the papers had been drafted. And all of a sudden, Mr. Gavin Watson came to his house together with their lawyers, and he told him that the matter is no longer going ahead. They have been advised by politicians not to proceed with the matter. They were told that it will be suicide. Then Mr. Agrizi insisted that Mr. Frolick should be called so that he, Agrizi, can confirm what Mr. Gavin Watson was saying to him about Mr. Frolick. So the call was placed on Mr. Frolick, to Mr. Frolick, and the phone was put on a speakerphone. And then Mr. Frolick instructed them that they should not proceed with the matter, and the matter was not proceeded with. And he said, Agrizi says he was very upset. As a result, he chased the team away from his home. That's the sum total of the evidence of Mr. Agrizi. And
yes, I think the gist of it is that Mr. Agrizi said Mr. Frolick facilitated their access to Mr. Vincent Smith after Mr. Vincent Smith had not been agreeing to see them. And he said Mr. Frolick facilitated that after he had been given some money by Bosasa. Yeah, okay, all right. So I just wanted to make sure that, because some of this evidence was led some time back, those who will be listening, they can see where it fits in.
Where it's going.
Yeah.
And then the evidence, Chair, you must have seen that there are a number of affidavits that have been put together. What has happened is Mr. Frolick filed this affidavit and applying to lead evidence. And then he dealt with the affidavit of Mr. Agrizi. Then Mr. Agrizi answered to that. And then Mr. Frolick replied to that. And then the latest is an additional reply to the affidavit of Mr. Njenje and Mr. Johan Blake, the affidavit which is outstanding, which will come true.
Yeah.
Now,
Okay.
so, Mr. Frolick, you have heard me when I was summarizing the gist of the issues today. And although you have filed the affidavit, you have filed an affidavit, it's heard and it reads smoothly and it's understandable if, for instance, you give a summary of your version of the events. Can you do that? But you are free to always look in your affidavit to check if you want to check some issues in your affidavit.
Yes, no-
Can we start with the issue of when did you meet Mr. Grizi for the first time?
Hang on one second. Maybe let's start. Mr. Frolick, you are a member of parliament, is that right?
That's correct, Chairperson.
When did you become a member of parliament for the first time?
1999, Chairperson.
1999. And you are resident in the Eastern Cape?
That's correct.
Yes. So that means you have been a member of parliament close over 20 years?
That's correct.
Over 20 years. When did you meet Mr. Grizi or Mr. Gavin Watson for the first time?
Chairperson, I met Mr. Gavin Watson through the acquaintance of Mr. Chiki Watson.
Yes.
He is the brother of Mr. Gavin Watson,
Yes.
and we've been involved in the non-racial sport movement in the
Yes.
Eastern Cape. I initially met Chiki, and after that I met the brothers,
Yes.
including Mr. Gavin Watson.
Yes.
The first time I met Mr. Grizi was when he visited Parliament with Mr. Njenje.
Yes. Okay, all right. Take it from there, Mr. Noche.
Yes. And
Chair, if I may interrupt, perhaps to get the chronology correct, if the witness can just tell you from when he had this relationship with Mr. Gavin Watson and the other Watsons.
Mr. Frolick, if you are happy to do so, you can just tell your story as you wish to tell it. And at a certain stage, Mr. Noche can then ask you questions. But if you want to just deal with 1, 2, 3 points, and then let Mr. Noche lead you, that's fine. But if you want to just tell the story, starting from your relationship with the Watsons and so on, it's fine.
Thank you, Chairperson. I prefer to do that, to tell the
Yes,
story,
okay.
to give the background. I
Yes.
think that context
Yes.
is important. Chairperson, my relationship with Mr. Daniel Watson, also known as Chiki Watson, started in the late 1980s when I was still a student at university and became involved in non-racial sport and politics. And we became personal friends. And subsequently to that, being elected to Member of Parliament, I served on the Sport and Recreation Committee in the National Assembly. And from 2004, I was part of a team that worked with other local rugby administrators in the Eastern Cape to support the rejuvenation of rugby in the Eastern Cape region as a whole. This initiative was strongly supported by the late Minister of Sport and Recreation, the late Reverend Arnold Stoffile, as well as the then Chairperson of the Portfolio Committee, Mr. Butana Kompela. In 2006-07, Mr. Chiki Watson was elected as President of Eastern Province Rugby, and immediately I was roped in as an advisor to Eastern Province Rugby. And that is where I was introduced to the other brothers, who were all involved in sport, and all of them were also involved in the African National Congress. A very strong emphasis was placed on building and rebuilding the rugby situation in the Eastern Cape, especially in light of the decision that was taken by the government to build a new multi-billion rand sports stadium in Nelson Mandela Metro. The late Reverend Arnold Stoffile informed me that, together with others, that they had to fight to get the stadium there. And one of the reasons that was raised dealt with the sustainability post the World Cup. And thus, it was important for us, and my constituency is in Nelson Mandela Metro in Port Elizabeth, that we put a team together, working with the rugby administrators on the one hand, but also working with the sport administrators at times to ensure that we get professional rugby and professional soccer to the stadium. And that was my involvement with that. Added to this strategy was also to encourage the hosting of other major sport and other events at the stadium. And subsequent to the work that was done by the group collectively, we succeeded in hosting major international football and rugby matches, including the International Rugby Board Sevens for 3 years at the stadium. And we also secured 2 professional teams to use the stadium as anchor tenants and as their bases. That is both the Southern Kings and Chippa United. During this period, I was a member of the ANC and the ANC whip on the Portfolio Committee on Sport and Recreation, and worked very closely with all stakeholders. Although I initially only acted as an advisor to EP Rugby Union, I formally joined the board in 2012 and also served as a director on the board of the company, the professional arm of the union. And it is a well-known fact that Eastern Province struggled financially, and thus there were no demands made or any expectation for payment of services. We did it voluntarily, with the understanding that logistical and travel support would be provided when needed. These travel arrangements were managed by the Eastern Province Rugby Office, and I only learned subsequently in a discussion with Mr. Watson after Mr. Agrisi's evidence that the travel agency that was used by Eastern Province Rugby Union at the time was also the service provider to Bosasa. That is the background to my involvement with the situation. I want to get to the visit, if I may, Chairperson. The visit to Bosasa, Chairperson, was initiated after there was discussions between Mr. Chiki Watson on the one hand and Mr. Butana Kompela. Of course, Mr. Watson mentioned that there was some youth facility where they're trying to get sport activities, soccer, going at this youth facility on the Bosasa premises, and that they would like the parliamentarians to see it, because at that stage nobody was really aware as to what the exact operations were. Everybody thought Bosasa was just dealing with one thing, but in fact it was a group of companies. The purpose of the visit was to the youth center that catered for these juvenile offenders, and also to establish what extent sport played in the process of rehabilitation of these youngsters. The arrangements was made by Mr. Watson. I was requested by Mr. Kompela to accompany him, which I've done on numerous occasions before, to other events and other meetings, because as you may be aware that Mr. Kompela has a physical disability and requires assistance, and he was comfortable with me traveling with him. And as such, over the years, we established a very close friendship, both as comrades and also as friends. The visit to Johannesburg, to Bosasa, Mr. Watson specifically requested me, since I was going to be in Johannesburg, to meet with a potential sponsor for Eastern Province Rugby Union in Johannesburg. We got to the Bosasa offices. We went straight into the office. I assume it was the office of Mr. Watson. And Mr. Kompela was not happy with the program that was arranged for the visit, because it was said it will be quite a lengthy visit and it will require a bit of time for us to spend there. And since both of us had other commitments, we were not prepared for such a long visit. And the specific reason why this visit was undertaken was, in fact, to go to the youth center. But those arrangements were not part of the plan. During that visit, we had a discussion with Mr. Watson. Of course, I know Mr. Gavin Watson. I've known him through his family. I regularly go to their houses. Politically, they've been supporting us all the years. So we had a discussion about other things. And Mr. Watson started complaining terribly about the bad treatment that he was getting from Parliament specifically. He claimed that he was writing, on behalf of his company, numerous letters to the Portfolio Committee on Correctional Services, and he doesn't even get a reply or response to the letters. He then also indicated that there's a narrative out that is in the media where the Portfolio Committee is giving an opportunity for certain information to be put in front of them without hearing the other side of the story. We then discussed it and we said that the best way we should approach it was to approach Mr. Smith directly. And I undertook to do it after discussion with Mr. Compella because also at the social level, I'm friends with Mr. Smith. And we also together as colleagues in Parliament. What happened during the interaction was, when we were sitting there, I said, but it's important if you want to go and visit a chairperson of a committee or parliamentary committee to write a letter and ask for an opportunity to do so. And Mr. Watson reiterated and said, but there's no response. I then said, okay, write again to them, and then I'll talk to Mr. Smith when I get back to Cape Town, which I did. And then I'm summarizing this part, Chairperson, so if you wish me to go into details, I'll be able to do so. I had a discussion with Mr. Smith, and he said, man, you know, there's big problems surrounding this company. And I said, but it's important just to hear the other side. You can meet them privately if you want to, or you can take it to your committee. In fact, it's better to take it to the committee, I reiterated also, because all our meetings are open to the public. Mr. Smith then said, you haven't received anything from Mr. Watson to request a meeting.
Sorry, Mr. Frolick. Now, I don't want us to leave the visit at the Bosasa complex.
Okay.
Yeah, let's deal with that.
Hang on. I think unless I misunderstood, I think what Mr. Frolick wanted to do, and I think his counsel wanted him to do, is to tell his story as he sees it, to cover what he wants to cover.
No, that's fine. No,
And
that's
then
fine,
afterwards, you can go from the beginning.
Okay, no, that's
Yeah,
fine.
yeah.
Then that's
Yeah,
fine.
let him cover what he wants to cover.
Then I'm
and
happy.
then after that, you can start from the beginning.
No,
Yeah.
then I'm happy with that.
Yeah.
No, thank you, Chairperson. That was also my understanding. So I'll proceed with the
Yes, proceed, yeah.
arrangements that was made
Yeah.
then for the visit to Parliament. Mr. Watson then called me to say that they've sent the documents some time ago already, and there was no reply. So I spoke to Mr. Smith, and he said, well, if they're in Cape Town on a certain day, then they can come, and he will hear what they have to say. And that is what happened. We did not expect Mr. Agrisi to visit. That was not part of the discussion that, as far as Mr. Watson was concerned.
I'm
he
sorry,
was
you didn't expect?
Mr. Agrisi.
Oh, you expected Mr. Watson?
Mr. Watson
Okay.
said he will come with the chairperson of the board, Mr. Njenje,
Yes.
to meet. So
Okay.
we didn't expect that. So on a specific day, the meeting was arranged, and I can clearly recall that I received a call from Mr. Watson, where he said that he's not coming anymore, but there's two people from his company and they are lost somewhere in Parliament. I found them in the passage and took them to my office, and then I went to inform Mr. Smith that they were there. Mr. Smith then said he doesn't really have time because he had another meeting to attend, but he'll quickly give them an ear. And that is what he did. He came into the office, they exchanged and introduced one another. At that specific point, my secretary came to call me out of my office because there was a sitting of Parliament in the afternoon. At the time, I was also the programming whip, and it had something to do with the speakers list for that afternoon that we quickly needed to resolve because it was about lunchtime. I then stepped out into the office just across from me to sort out the problem, and on my return, they were no longer there. They had left. So I walked down the passage and towards the exit, and I found Mr. Njenje and Mr. Agrisi there, standing there. And I asked, so what happened? Did you have time to discuss? And they said, no, it didn't go well. Mr. Smith was in a hurry, and he left. I then, because it was lunchtime, and we were standing virtually next to the old assembly restaurant, I said to them, well, I'm going to have lunch here. You gentlemen are welcome to join me. And we had lunch. And during the lunch conversation, Deputy Chief Justice, we discussed a number of other issues related to Parliament. There was no tour that took place because we don't act as tour guides in Parliament. There's a specific unit that deals with that. But we walked past the old assembly where the original apartheid government sat. And that is basically what I said. This is where they used to sit. We then had lunch, and they reflected on the food that they were eating and the fact that they must rush back to Johannesburg. And that was it. Insofar as Mr. Agrisi alleged that there was reference to me as the chair of chairs during the visit that I referred to at Bosasa, is not correct. Because I was only elected, and with your permission, Chairperson, it is a term that is being used, chair of chairs. It's actually a house chairperson responsible for committees and other things. So that is not correct. I was only elected on the 18th of November 2010 by the National Assembly as the house chairperson, commonly referred to as a chair of chair. I also deny that I received money from Mr. Gavin Watson or any other person during that visit to Bosasa, as alleged by Mr. Agrisi. I also wish to point out that I was in the company of Mr. Kompela for the duration of this visit. And I just see it as an attempt by Mr. Agrisi to create an opportunity for me to be alone with Mr. Gavin Watson, because that did not take place. It's untrue and artificial. I've dealt with the meeting with Mr. Smith and how it played out. I want Chairperson also to refer to a very specific reference that was made by Mr. Agrisi in terms of an invoice from Blake's Travel. And I can confirm that that was for accommodation when I attended a rugby test match between the Springboks and the All Blacks at the FNB Stadium in Johannesburg on the 22nd of August, in my capacity as an advisor and representative of Eastern Province Rugby Union. These arrangements were made by the office of Mr. Chiki Watson in his capacity as the president, and I was under the impression that that cost was borne by Eastern Province Rugby Union and no one else. I want to get to the point on advice on litigation, because I think it's a very important point. I did not have a telephonic discussion with Mr. Agrisi, as he originally stated in his first appearance in this commission. I think Advocate Noche referred to it, that I received a call on a Wednesday morning just after 9:15 from Mr. Watson, and he was complaining, like he previously did, about the bad treatment and this and that, and he saw it as an attempt to undermine him and the companies that he has and all this and that, and that they want to litigate against the Department of Justice and Correctional Services. He told me that he was on speakerphone and that his attorneys were there, as well as two of his directors. And he was referring, litigating the department for not awarding tenders to them and destroying the company in the process. I indicated to him very clearly, and this can be attested to the other people who were part of that conference call, that it was up to them ultimately to decide whether to continue or not. But they should consider the impact the litigation could have on their future business relationships, especially with government departments. Before terminating this short discussion, I reiterated it, and I told them that if they do feel they have a case, they should do what they think is in their best interest. But that is just my view. It's free advice. Contrary to what Mr. Agrisi stated, I did not issue an instruction on the course of action to undertake or for them to stop the litigation. Chairperson, if I may, I want to continue now with another point that emanated in the evidence that was given to this commission by Mr. Agrisi on his first appearance, and it deals with the accommodation of Minister Masuta. Shortly after the 2014 general election, I was deployed by the African National Congress in the Eastern Cape as the convener of the Basel February detachment that conducts sectoral work amongst minority communities in the province. A number of other members of parliament members of the legislature and councillors were at the time members of the detachment. And as convener, I regularly interacted with the Provincial Secretary's office on the work that we're doing, as well as the relevant executive council members at municipal, provincial, and national government level to intervene where we see blockages in service delivery and resolve these issues. My responsibilities also include, because I'm still the convener of the detachment chairperson, the organizing of sectoral activities, networking events, and securing the relevant member of the executive to attend these events. In the run-up to the 2016 local government elections, the detachment did extensive work in the Nelson Mandela Bay metropolitan area because of our assessment that we're in trouble in that metro. Issues raised by the community and sectors related to issues such as the recognition of the Khoisan, allocation of fishing rights, gangsterism, challenges related to the criminal justice system, the non-payment of maintenance that is received by courts to the beneficiaries, and so forth. The detachment then decided it would be important to get the relevant minister or deputy minister to come and to address these issues, because we were in the final stages of preparing for the local government election rally, the launch of the ANC election manifesto for the local government that was held in Port Elizabeth subsequently. I conveyed the views of the detachment to the regional office and requested that they secure the relevant deployments, but found out it was difficult to secure the necessary confirmations from the relevant ministers and deputy ministers. I informed the detachment that we had difficulties, and some of them said, but you are with these comrades for years in Parliament. Can't you approach some of them and ask them, if they're coming to the rally on the Saturday, can't they arrive earlier so that they can interact with the community on some of these issues? I subsequently had a discussion, and one of the colleagues I approached is Deputy Minister Papela, who confirmed that he would be in Port Elizabeth and that he's available for such a networking event on the Friday evening. He indicated to me that even though he's confirming he's having difficulties, or his office is having difficulties in securing accommodation in Port Elizabeth, and he said the hotels were full. I then asked one of my colleagues to check, and they confirmed hotels and B&Bs were full because of the number of people that was going to attend the launch of the manifesto. I asked him whether he knew of any other members of the executive who would be in PE before the launch of the manifesto, and he indicated that he knows that Minister Masuta, the then Minister Masuta, could be in Port Elizabeth before the launch, but that he was also struggling in securing accommodation. And he confirmed what my colleague from the detachment said, hotels, bed and breakfast were full. We phoned around, and some of our local contacts agreed to make accommodation available that would be suitable to the members of the executive who will be attending. I contacted Minister Masuta, who confirmed his early arrival in Port Elizabeth and his availability to attend some of these activities. He requested me to contact his office, which I did, to make the necessary arrangements. In contacting his office informed me of the difficulties they had. I informed them that there were local accommodation, it's private accommodation that would be available, but we need the member of the executive to attend some of our activities as well. The office then requested accommodation for 3 evenings, from the Thursday to the Sunday, for Minister Masuta and his staff. Arrangements were then made for the minister and his support staff, which ultimately included 4 people to stay in a house made available for this purpose by the wife of Mr. Valence Watson. As it turned out, Chairperson, the minister only arrived in Port Elizabeth on the Saturday morning of the launch of the manifesto, and he did not attend any activities. Upon realizing that accommodation was not going to be used, because we could see no one is turning up, an attempt was made to get the keys from the house from the minister's driver, who arrived in Port Elizabeth earlier, to allocate the accommodation to someone else. Unfortunately, The driver had to leave to Bloemfontein to collect the minister there because there were no flights available to Port Elizabeth, and he took the keys with him. The accommodation for the minister could thus not be relocated to anyone else. It must be emphasized that the arrangements was not only for the then Minister Masuta, but also to a number of other comrades who required accommodation. For instance, I had to secure accommodation for the support staff of Deputy Minister Bapela, who also could not get accommodation on the Friday and Saturday evenings. Mr. Masuta thus only made use of the accommodation on the Saturday night. On the Sunday morning, I phoned Minister Masuta to make arrangements for the keys to be collected. He asked me to express gratitude and appreciation for the utilization of the house to the owner. I told him that the owner would come and fetch the keys and he could thank the owner himself. Contrary to the affidavit of Mr. Agritzi, the house used by the minister is in a residential area literally a few minutes away from Nelson Mandela Bay Stadium and not in a private estate. On the allegation that I received money from Bosasa, Gavin Watson and Valence Watson, Chairperson, I wish to state that I did not receive money from Bosasa, Mr. Gavin Watson or Valence Watson, let alone monthly payments, as alleged by Mr. Agritzi in his supplementary affidavit. During 2014, before the general election, I received amounts totaling about 25,000 rand from Mr. Valence Watson as a contribution towards the ANC election funds. At the time, I served on the Finance and Fundraising Committee of the ANC in the region, and I'm still a member of that fundraising committee. And these monies were properly handled and handed over to the regional secretary of the ANC, and it was also confirmed by the regional treasurer. I do not recall a meeting that Mr. Agritzi is referring to at the house of Mr. Valence Watson in Port Elizabeth, as alleged, or for that matter anywhere else in Port Elizabeth, and I deny evidence that I received money from Mr. Valence Watson as testified by him. I respectfully point out that Mr. Agritzi did not indicate how I would have received these monthly payments from them. But for the one payment he alleges that he took to Port Elizabeth and gave to Mr. Valence Watson, which Mr. Valence Watson then allegedly gave to me, surely, if there were such monthly payments, there should have been a certain process or procedure to record it. Furthermore, one would expect Mr. Agritzi to recall for what period such monthly amounts were made. One would also expect that some entry would have been made somewhere for the monthly payments to me. Mr. Agritzi's failure to give any detail on the alleged irregular payments speaks volumes and unfortunately always also makes it difficult for me, Chairperson, to respond comprehensively to him. I have to add that during the course of 2013-14, I received a desktop computer for my constituency office that was arranged by Mr. Chiki Watson for learners and students to assist them in their studies. And I also received, Chairperson, 2 shirts, 2 pairs of shoes, and a belt from Mr. Chiki Watson sometime on my birthday, and I've subsequently then declared that in Parliament in the members' register. I also want to add, Chairperson, at the time when these allegations were made, I specifically went to the Registrar of Members' Interest to go and see what have I declared, because over time, I'm there for a long time, you forget if you have declared something or not declared something. And at that stage, they were busy, and that office was, there was a temporary or acting registrar that was there. And they had difficulty retrieving the documents because they had a new system that they were busy implementing. I then explained to the acting registrar, Advocate Vanara, what the situation was. And he indicated to me that, you know, some of these things that you're mentioning at your constituency office and this and that, it's not things that you received. But I said to him, no, I still want to make sure that it is declared and that it is there, right? And I submitted again an annexure that was included into the Registrar of Members' Interest. That, Chairperson, is my first affidavit in response to the allegations that were made by Mr. Agritzi. I thank you for your time.
Thank you. We are at tea break time. So I think we'll take the tea break, and then when we come back, then Mr. Nocha can start with questioning. Is that all right? Okay, let's adjourn now. We'll resume at 11:30. We adjourn.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Mr. Notcher.
Chair, we have now printed the latest affidavit of Mr. Frolick. I'm not certain whether we should just deal with it and then see whether he wants to comment on it, and then have it as evidence, and then I can then clarify certain issues with him.
I think you should proceed with questioning, and when you come to it, I mean, obviously he knows his affidavit.
Sure, all right.
You will just continue and question him.
No, that's fine.
Yeah.
Now, Mr. Frolick, I understand when you say you were elected as a Member of Parliament in 1999. Am I right?
That's correct.
Yeah. And then, if I understand, you were orientated about the rules of Parliament and the different functions, the committees and all that.
That's correct.
And then you were also orientated on the functions of the portfolio committees.
Correct.
And if I understand correctly, the portfolio committees they have an oversight on their portfolios, meaning they have an oversight on the functions of the executive. Am I right?
Correct.
And so they interact with the executive. Am I right?
That's correct.
And they are not there to advise members of the public about their issues with the executive.
I don't agree with you.
What do you say?
The role of the Portfolio Committee as an extension of the National Assembly, in terms of the powers also that these committees have,
Yes.
they have the authority to call anyone, not only the executive. They exercise oversight over the executive, but they can call anyone and, if necessary, summon anyone to come and appear in front of it. And as such, their programs are in their hands and they execute it in terms of those rules.
Yes. But the main thing is to ensure that the executive acts in terms of the Constitution, and their its interaction with the public is in respect of that role. Am I right?
Well, their responsibility is to exercise oversight over the executive
Yes.
and to keep executive members accountable. That's one of their responsibilities.
I see. Now let's deal with the visit at the Bosasa Park. All right. Now, in your affidavit, you say you use these words. You do not recall whether. So it says, as far I'm on page 35 of the record, Bosasa 3. On paragraph 17, the last sentence, you say, as far as I recall, Mr. Agrizi was not present during these discussions.
That's
So
correct.
yes. Yeah. Now, when you say, as far as I recall, you mean he could have been there, but you forgot? Or you say he was not there?
I can recall, sir, that in terms of the affidavit as I submitted, that I, up to today, cannot recall the first time that I met Mr. Agrizi was when he arrived in Parliament. He was not part of the deliberations that day.
Please, the word recall, I cannot recall, is pregnant. In the sense that when you say I cannot recall, you mean I cannot remember. And you mean it's something that could have happened. Am I right?
Well,
Is that what you mean here?
no, what I specifically saying, sir.
Please face this side, Mr. Frolick.
Oh, my apologies,
Yeah.
Chairperson. My
Yeah.
apologies.
Okay.
Now, I can, the context in which I use recall is that Mr. Agrizi was not present during that meeting or discussion. 3 people were there, was Mr. Gavin Watson, myself, and Mr. Kompela.
I understand it to simply say, that as far as your memory is concerned, you don't remember him being present in that discussion. That suggests to me that you are saying maybe somebody can tell me things that might make me remember that he was present. Maybe there's something that I can't remember, but as far as I can recall, I don't remember him being present in the discussion. I understand you to be saying that.
Chairperson, if I may,
Yes.
that is exactly the context, because
Yes.
we must keep in mind that the incidents referred to here happened in 2010.
Yes, yes,
And
yes.
I'm no longer got the fresh mind and memory left in me
Yeah,
that I
yeah,
used
it's
to
a
have.
long time.
So it's in that context.
Yeah, okay. So that's how I understand it, Mr. Noche.
No, I understand. No,
If somebody else comes and says, I definitely was there,
Yeah.
then it would be subject to questioning
Yes.
to see whether that was so.
So when Mr. Agrees says he was there, so you are saying, well, that's his recollection. Am I right?
That's his recollection, sir.
So you can't dispute that he was there, that's his recollection.
I wish to restate as the Chief Justice, Deputy Chief Justice. My apologies, I must get used to swinging around.
I think a lot of witnesses like looking at the evidence leader, not at me.
No, Chair, with this one, I know I look pretty.
There's beauties in the behold. It's in the eye of the behold, Chief Justice, the prettiness. I fully agree with him. Now, I wish to restate, as you correctly summarized it, Chief Justice. If Mr. Agrisi comes and he can provide proof that he was part of that discussion, then it can possibly refresh my memory, and given the specific circumstances, and then I will be able to deal with it.
Now, can you just tell the Commission this? Do you confirm that Mr. Compella had to be driven around in a golf cart?
On the visit that I'm referring to,
Yes.
Mr. Compella was not driven in any golf cart. He didn't go anywhere out of that office that day.
Did he come from the car to the office?
Yes.
How did he walk from the car to the office?
He used his crutches.
I see. And now I see here that there is a confirmatory affidavit of Mr. Compella, but the affidavit is attached to your second affidavit. Are you saying he's confirming your first affidavit as well?
The confirmatory affidavit of Mr. Compella confirms my first affidavit
As well.
that I submitted. Yes.
Because I'll tell you why I'm saying that. Because he confirms an affidavit, not affidavits. But you say he's confirming both.
Well, what I know is that the affidavit that Mr. Compella is referring to is the first affidavit that I just went through with you now, that we could not share.
Mr.
That is-
Compella's affidavit.
That he's referring to that affidavit. My first one, as it appears on page 8, I think, or let me just get the paging right. Actually started on page 31.
Look,
Mr. Chairperson, if I may interrupt.
Yes.
In his affidavit signed on 3 September, which is a few days after the affidavit of Mr. Compella, at record page 57, paragraph 4.8, he says, I attach here to marked A confirmatory affidavit by Mr. Butana Moses Compella, deposed to him on 29 August 2019, and that's the one in question, in which he confirms inter alia what I have stated in my previous affidavit in regard to the visit on which I accompanied him. That's the context.
Okay, okay. Thank you.
the affidavit of Mr. Compella is on page 67. Now, this affidavit is attached to your replying affidavit, I may so speak. And he says, I've read the affidavit of Cedric Thomas Frolick and confirmed the contents thereof insofar as it relates to me. So is he referring to this affidavit or to both?
Well, that affidavit of Mr. Compella was attested to on the 29th of August 2019.
Yes.
As at that time, okay, I see that in his affidavit, he refers to the affidavit of Cedric Thomas Frolick. As at the 29th August 2019, how many affidavits had you put sent to the commission, Mr. Frolick? Only one or?
Now, in total, I think it's, with a condoning affidavit, it's about four different affidavits.
Oh,
Mr. Chairperson, if I may come in here. At that stage, on the 29th of August, there were only the two affidavits, the Condemnation Application Affidavit, which does not refer really to Mr. Compella, and then the affidavit of the 29th of April 2019, which refers to Mr. Compella. That's the first affidavit that he refers to in his affidavit on the 3rd of September, a few days later.
yes, okay. Mr. Noche?
Now, so when you discussed this issue with Mr. Compella must have seen the affidavit of Mr. Agrizi, am I right?
I don't know if Mr. Compella had a look at the affidavit of Mr. I don't think so. What I know is that Mr. Compella was following the proceedings of the commission, and then I indicated to him that I'm submitting an affidavit to respond to the allegations, and he agreed with me that that is the correct sequence of events as it unfolded.
Did he deny that Mr. Agrizi was at the Bosasa Center?
In terms of his affidavit, he agrees to what I say, that as far as his recollection is concerned, Mr. Agrizi was not part of the discussions that took place, that I refer to in my affidavit that I just went through.
So also he does not deny it, but he says he can't recall.
That's what we're saying is, as far as his recollection is concerned, unless proven differently, of course, I can't speak on his behalf, but he concurred with my response in the affidavit as it is there, Chairperson.
Now, Mr. Agrizi says, at some stage, Mr. Compella stood up and took a telephone call, and Mr. Agrizi had to hold a door for him. Does Mr. Compella deny that?
Sir, what I can say as far as that is concerned, Chairperson, is that as far as my recollection goes, is that Mr. Compella didn't even leave the meeting room because it was such a short engagement that we have.
So you're saying a door was not held for Mr. Compella to take a telephone call? Is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is that as far as my recollection goes, Chairperson, is that Mr. Compella did not leave the room or office that we were sitting in.
Did he stand up? Did he at any stage stand up?
As far as I can recall, Mr. Compella did not stand up. Mr. Compella was seated.
And did he take a call?
As far as I can recall, based on my recollection, Chairperson, he did not take a call.
Did you ask him about this?
I asked him specifically that either he himself or me leave that venue that day, and he said that he can't recall that we ever left. We came in together and we left together.
And did you ask him whether a door was held for him by Mr. Agrizi?
Since he said that he cannot recall leaving the office, the issue of the door never arose, Chairperson, of doors being held for Mr. Compella.
Did he say also he could not recall you talking to Gavin Watson aside?
Mr. Compella is clear that my version that I'm giving is also the recollection that he have of the meeting that took place, Chairperson.
Does his recollection to the fact that he did not see you talking to Mr. Gavin aside?
Mr. Compella, in terms of his recollection, confirms what I say in my affidavit, Chairperson, that I had no side discussions with Mr. Gavin Watson. There was no need to have side discussions with anyone.
Now, again, all of this, you're saying it's a recollection and it's not a denial of that this happened. It's as far as you can recall.
As
It
far
could have
as,
happened, but you can't remember now.
as far as I can recall, Chairperson, if Mr. Agrizzi comes and he gives concrete evidence of what has happened, so that we can look at it, then we can interrogate that evidence that is there. But my recollection is as it is stated in my affidavit.
But the evidence he has given, Mr. Frolick, is he says he can recall. He recalls this. And you are saying you're not denying them, but you say you can't recall.
Now, I can't speak for Mr. Agrizzi, Chairperson. I don't know what he recalls and can recall and cannot recall. So unfortunately, I cannot comment on the recalling ability of Mr. Agrizzi.
I think what Mr. Noche is trying to do is to say, here is a situation where you can't recall, but Mr. Agrizzi says he recalls what happened, and giving you a chance to say what you might wish to say, given that Mr. Agrizzi seems to be clear that that is what happened.
Now, I dispute what Mr. Agrizzi's version of events is,
Yes.
Chairperson.
Okay.
So are you moving now from not recalling to disputing?
I can confirm, Chairperson, that as far as leaving the office room and as far as Mr. Compella, a door being held for him, those things definitely did not take place. My recollection is that both of us remained inside in that office until we left.
Now, from moving from not recalling to disputing, does that also apply to Mr. Compella? Is he now saying he now disputes?
Mr.
Do you know?
Mr. Compella's
Well,
affidavit.
just before you respond, Mr. Noche, I'm not sure that it's fair to ask him more details about what Mr. Compella's version is in circumstances where I think you want him to say what may or may not be confirmed by Mr. Compella's confirmatory affidavit, because Mr. Compella's confirmatory affidavit, it simply seeks to confirm only that which in his affidavit relates to him, from Mr. Compella. So as long as I think what you can ask him, and you can tell me if you want to submit differently. I think what you can ask him his version, and when Mr. Compella comes, you can confront him with what he was confirming. What do you say?
Chair, there is this. Mr. Frolick didn't confine himself in his answers today to the confirmatory affidavit and his affidavit. He goes on and tells you what Mr. Compella told him. So I think he is able to tell you what Mr. Compella told him.
Didn't he say that in response to your question about what Mr. Compella, whether Mr. Compella confirms his version? Because if he was responding to that, that might be different.
So what I asked him was this. I said that when you spoke to Mr. Compella about this incident, does he confirm ABCD? One, he doesn't say, I didn't speak to him about it. They spoke to you about it. And he doesn't say to you, Mr. Compella didn't give me an answer. He gives you an answer. That I'll be fair to the
you may be right. I mean, if he is able to say, well, I know what Mr. Compella's version is on this point, this is what it is, that's fine. You know, I was just concerned that Mr. Kompela's confirmatory affidavit doesn't seek to confirm everything that is in Mr. Frolick's affidavit. It purports to confirm only those parts that relate to Mr. Kompela. So that has got to be borne in mind. But of course, if Mr. Frolick deals with other matters that don't relate to, that are not confirmed by the confirmatory affidavit, on the basis that he has had a discussion with Mr. Kompela about those other matters, he knows what his version is, that may be different.
Yes, Chair,
So-
that is, I was careful.
Yeah, so maybe go ahead, but bear in mind this discussion.
Yes, I'm careful about that.
Yes.
Only thing I cannot be able to be unfair to ask him about what he has not been told by Mr.
Yes,
Kompela.
yeah. Okay.
So if I understand, Mr. Frolick, is you're saying when you discussed with Mr. Kompela,
Yes.
he said to you, he cannot recall whether one agrees was there. Is that correct?
Well, Chairperson, my version of events is that Mr. Agrisi was not part of that meeting. That was confirmed by Mr. Kompela as well. My version is that I never left that boardroom or office with Mr. Watson for a side meeting or anything. As far as my recollection goes, Mr. Kompela remained in that office, and that is what Mr. Kompela in his affidavit is exactly saying.
And tell me, just before I go further, are you saying this meeting at the Bosasa offices was you were merely accompanying Mr. Kompela as your friend, am I right?
That's correct, Chairperson. I was requested by Mr. Kompela to accompany him, and that is the reason why
you were
I went
not
there.
going to the offices of
Thank you. Okay, just ask that question again, Mr.
say the visit at the Bosasa Business Park. He was merely accompanying Mr. Kompela. Am I right?
Mr. Kompela requested me to accompany him. Mr. Chiki Watson indicated that Mr. Kompela wanted to visit the facility and asked me, am I going to accompany Mr. Kompela, which I did. And that is how we ended up at the offices.
And at that stage, you were a member of the Portfolio Committee for Sport.
That's correct.
And you were not a member of the Portfolio Committee for Correctional Services.
That's correct.
Now, when Mr. Gavin Watson asked you about matters regarding the Portfolio Committee of Correctional Services, why did you entertain him on that?
Chairperson, it's not as if I didn't know Mr. Gavin Watson. I knew him for quite some time before that. And the nature of politicians are that then they sit in a discussion and different matters come up. Then you interact with that, because we are not only politicians or members of parliament serving on specific committees, but you do have interest broadly in what is taking place. So if a member of the public or anyone comes to you to complain about the lack of social services, then you can't tell that person, I'm the member of a sport and recreation committee, I can't comment on that. It's got nothing to do with me. And that was the nature of the discussion.
I see. Now, did at any stage Mr. Gavin Watson leave the place where you were seated? Or you can't recall?
Chairperson, as far as my recollection goes, Mr. Watson was there inside the discussion that we were having. That is the best that I can recall. And as I said, it was a short engagement. And as far as my recollection goes, he didn't leave that room.
And you didn't, did you see his vault?
No, Chairperson, I didn't see a vault.
And you won't dispute that there is a vault nearby where you were seated?
I was not taken around the offices, Chairperson, to show me the layout of the office and where this and that are. We arrived and we went specifically into the one office.
Now, Mr. Agrizi recalls Mr. Watson excusing himself and going to his vault. What do you say about that?
Chairperson, I cannot recall. It's beyond my recollection for Mr. Watson. I've just indicated as far as my recollection is, he was part of the discussion and he did not leave the meeting.
Now, the travel costs, you say you will not dispute that they were paid by Bosasa, but you are saying you didn't know that they were paid by Bosasa.
Chairperson, as far as those travel costs are concerned, the original arrangements was made by, as I indicated earlier, by Mr. Chiki Watson. And I had a second task, and that was to go meet with a potential sponsor as well. So I was under the impression that that was the arrangements that was made by Mr. Watson, and that is as far as I can recall those arrangements that were made. I also wish to indicate, Chairperson, that when Mr. Agrisi made these different comments and things, I once again approached Mr. Watson, and I said to him, but this, what do you say this? And he struggled, because he was no longer involved with Eastern Province Rugby at the time. He struggled to recollect and what to say and this, that, and the other. And that is why I also stated in my last declaration that I made to the National Assembly that since Mr. Watson could not remember, that there could have been a possibility that Bosasa paid the cost.
And in the latest affidavit you filed also a confirmatory affidavit of Chiki Watson.
Which is the latest affidavit you're referring to, Advocate?
The one you filed in August. Remember
August.
the one which was not in the bundle, the one we have just added now.
Oh, the one that was not part of your records.
Yes,
Is it now in the bundle?
it's now in the bundle.
Yes.
It's, if you look at page 121.
Oh, yes. Okay. I'm with you, Advocate.
Yes. And did you ask him, when you asked for this affidavit, to deal with this issue that has come up, that the payments were made by Blake Travel and not by EP Rugby?
Chairperson, the nature of these arrangements between Blake Travel, I did not get involved in the operational issues. You will be told that there's traveling arrangements that has been made and you'll be going there. And in executing those tasks, you are under the impression that it was arrangements that was done by the office of Mr. Watson in Eastern Province Rugby Union. It only arose later when there was a specific payment from the office of EP, that they came and they said there's an amount that they must pay, because that was the agreement between me and the Eastern Province Rugby, that if there are personal costs involved, for instance, if I struggle to secure a flight or whatever, then I'll say to them, make arrangements for me and give me the invoice, then I'll pay for it. And in such instances, I would go. And on more than one occasion, I paid the money to Eastern Province Rugby, either in a form of check or if it's small amounts in cash.
Yeah, I understand. The affidavit of Mr. Watson, I say, was commissioned in August 2020. Am I right? This was after it has come out that the travel costs were paid by Blake Travel and Bosasa. Am I right?
Well, what was presented to me and what I was made aware of, and that did not appear in the original evidence that was given by Mr. Agrisi here in front of the Commission, is that there were supplementary affidavits forwarded, amongst other, from Blake Travel, where they stipulate things. So I said, Mr. Watson, Chiki, can you remember these things that were there? And he said, no, man, those were things that through my office we've arranged. And then he also said, but in certain cases you came and you paid. Right? At that stage, I realized that the Blake's travel that they were referring to here in the commission, and it was confirmed also to be by Mr. Watson then, is the same Blake's travel that is being used by Bosasa.
So also, do you confirm that then, that Mr. Chiki Watson does not deny that your costs were paid by Bosasa?
Mr. Chiki Watson, Chairperson, when I took him through the list of things, and he said, no, all of these things were things that were arranged for your traveling in terms of the arrangements for Eastern Province Rugby, or in other instances, I would ask them to make a booking, they would come back with the invoice, and somebody in the office will call you and say that you must either pay Eastern Province Rugby now, pay them, or you must make out the check to the travel agent.
Did he explain to you why your expenses were to be paid by Bosasa?
No, Chairperson.
Did you ask him why?
I asked him, but how could it happen that the Bosasa issue and the work of Eastern Province Rugby got mixed with one another? And he indicated to me to say that the Blake's Travel Agency very often took a lot of time before they would send invoices through to Eastern Province Rugby. And that is what they dealt with in the administration. I was not told by Mr. Watson that Bosasa is making this payment or making that payment.
No, I understand. At the time, he didn't tell you. But now that you came to know that this payment was made by Bosasa, did he tell you why was the payment made by Bosasa instead of?
No, Chairperson.
He didn't explain that to you.
No.
Right. Now, before we leave the issue of the boardroom at the Bosasa Business Center, are you now saying that Mr. Compella was with you all the time, and if you had been given money, you would have seen it?
That's correct, sir.
And unless he cannot recall it?
Chairperson, if I was handed anything since Mr. Compella was with me, then Mr. Compella would have been aware of it. He would have seen it.
And unless he was busy on a phone call and he was at the door?
I already indicated to you, sir, as far as my recollection go, that Mr. Compella did not leave the meeting venue and did not have a phone call as far as I can recollect.
Sorry, perhaps I don't want us to be at cross purposes. The evidence of Mr. Agrees, as I understand, is that Mr. Compella did not leave the complex or the office, but he stood at the door to take this call.
No, I can't recall that happening, Chairperson. I can't recall that.
And I'm sure if Mr. Agrees held the door of Mr. Compella cannot miss seeing Mr. Agrees right in front of him.
Chairperson, I've indicated earlier, Mr. Agrisi was never there. He was not there in our discussions. He was not part of the discussions taking place. So from where would he appear all of a sudden to come and hold the door? I don't know from where he was making his observations. I cannot speculate.
Now, Mr. Agrees, before I get to that, you know Mr. Valance Watson?
I do know Mr. Valance Watson, yes.
And have you been to his place?
I have been to his place a number of times, Chairperson.
And there was a visit that Mr. Agrees mentions that he visited Mr. Wallace's place and then he met you there. Do you remember that?
I can't recall that, Chairperson. I really can't remember, and that's why I also stated it in my affidavit.
Now
Well,
tell me.
I'm sorry, Mr. Noche, before you move away from the visit to Bosasa, I remember that between your affidavit, Mr. Frolick, and the affidavits of Mr. Agrees, there seems to be a tension between his affidavit and yours in terms of what the purpose of the visit was. You say one thing, and I think he says something else. I was trying to look here. Mr. Noche, can you remember what that is about? There are two different
Mr. Chris's evidence is that
objectives.
Mr. Chris's evidence was that they wanted to show Mr. Frolick and his company what the Bosasa was actually doing.
Yes. There was something about the youth center or some center, because in one of his affidavits, Mr. Agrizi challenges the purpose of the visit as stated by Mr. Frolick on the basis, I think Mr. Frolick mentioned something like they wanted to see sports facilities for young people, and Mr. Agrizi says, in effect, that could never have been the purpose, because the area where the center is tarred. There would not have been any facilities. I think that's what I would like you to get Mr. Frolick to deal with.
Yes. Mr. Frolick, just turn to page 23.
What page?
Page 23, Chairperson.
2-3.
Chairperson, if I may interrupt,
Yes,
I think what you are referring to is at page 55,
55.
paragraphs 4.2 and 4.3.
Okay, thank you.
But can we start at 23 before we get to 55?
Mr. Noche, you said we must start where?
At page 23.
22.
23.
Okay. So it's necessary to look at what the purpose of the visit
Yes,
was,
that
as testified to by Mr. Frolick, and look at what the purpose, what Mr. Agrizi says the purpose was, and to examine each one of them.
Yes, at 23, page 23 is what Mr. Agrizi says was the purpose. Paragraph 51.
Yes.
Then, do you see that, Mr. Frolick?
It says the purpose of the meeting that was being scheduled was to arrange a visit to showcase the business park to the two gentlemen,
Yes.
so that they had an idea of the magnitude of the business and what it had to offer, especially in terms of BEE development. That is what Agrizi says.
And then on page 44, paragraph 7. Actually, before we get there, Chair, before you get to page 44,
Yeah.
we turn to page 34, which is the affidavit now of Mr. Frolick. On paragraph 13,
Paragraph 13.
we are on page 34.
Paragraph 7, add paragraph 13,
No, on page 34,
34.
yeah, 34, Chairperson. 34. Sorry. Paragraph, page 34, paragraph 13.
Okay, yes. Whose affidavit is
This
this?
is the affidavit of Mr. Frolick,
Yes.
where he says the visit to Bosasa office was initiated and arranged between Mr. Compella, in his capacity as the chairperson of the Portfolio Committee on Sport and Recreation, and Mr. Chiki Watson. The purpose of the visit was to visit the youth center that catered for juvenile offenders and to establish to what extent sports played a role and was used in the process of rehabilitation. And then on page 44, paragraph 7, Mr. Agrizi deals with that. He says, save for noting the contents of this paragraph, I wish to state that the real purpose, the real reason and purpose of the visit was to create more credibility for Bosasa with relevant persons.
Yes, and
And then on page
of
55.
course, then page 55.
Mr. Chairperson, may I interrupt?
Yes, yes.
If you look at page 44, where we've just been referred to paragraph 7.1,
Yeah,
you should also read paragraph 8.1.
yes.
He said,
Yes, 8.1, I do not dispute the close friendship as comrades and friends between Mr. Compella and Mr. Cedric Frolick, but I state further that the main purpose of the visit was to resolve the position relating to Mr. Smith and the portfolio committee at the relevant department. I think you are correct, Mr. Van Zyl. It's important. Yes. And then, of course, 55. In 4.1, and that is Mr. Frolick's affidavit.
Yes.
4.1, I have in paragraph 13 of my original affidavit stated that the purpose of the visit to Bosasa's offices was to visit the youth center that catered for juvenile offenders and to establish to what extent sport played a role and was used in the process of rehabilitation of these youngsters. 4.2, in reply thereto, Mr. agrees in paragraph 7 of his affidavit in response, states that the real reason and purpose of the visit was to create more credibility for Bosasa with the relevant persons. I presume his reference to the relevant persons is a reference to Mr. Compella and I. It is not clear why Bosasa would want to create more credibility with Mr. Compella and me, as Mr. Compella was the chairperson of the Portfolio Committee on Sport and Recreation, whilst Bosasa was involved with the Department of Correctional Services and Justice. I also had nothing to do with those departments. Okay, I just wanted that you maybe you deal with that, the issue of the different purposes.
Mr. Chairperson, he
Yes.
goes on in the next paragraphs
Yes,
to deal with the contradiction in Mr.
Yes.
Agrisu's evidence as to the purpose.
yes. But let me just see.
4.3,
In
4.4.
paragraph 8.1 of his affidavit in response, Mr. Chris contradicts what he stated in paragraph 7 with regard to the purpose of the visit. He stated therein that the main purpose of the visit was to resolve the position relating to Mr. Smith and the Portfolio Committee at the relevant department. This is clearly not a reference to the Portfolio Committee on Sport and Recreation. Yeah, Mr. Noche, can you just put questions to Mr. Frolick to deal with those different purposes or different versions about purposes?
One, Mr. Frolick, you say the confirmatory affidavit of Mr. Compella. Are you saying it confirms that the visit was arranged and initiated and arranged between him and Mr. Chiki Watson?
That's correct.
So is that what he's confirming?
That's correct.
And now, as we have read to you, Mr. agrees says the meeting was for something different. It was to present the scope of the work of the company. You read that?
I've read that, sir.
Yes. And when you were there, you also confirmed that there was an issue raised regarding the problem with the Correctional Service Portfolio Committee.
But that's what I state in my affidavit, yes.
And did you not ask as to why, when the purpose of the visit was for the sports and recreation, now you are asked about correctional services issues?
Chairperson, as I stated earlier, is that when we deal with matters, we are not restricted, so that question didn't arise to ask, but why are you dealing now with matters of this nature? It didn't arise.
Now, when you were
Yes.
there, what were the issues of sports and recreation that were discussed at the meeting?
Mr. Watson referred to they were apparently busy with the juvenile section and the youngsters who are there in the youth center to get them involved with activities. Not in rugby, as Mr. Agrizi states in his affidavit. Nothing to do with rugby. And what he said was that the difficulty they have with these recreational things is that it is expensive, it is not very well supported from people outside, and there's no government support. So he does it on his own as part of his social responsibility to the youth center that is there. He also stated that they were in the process of establishing a football soccer team so that they can participate, and he would wish that he can get support for that as well. And it is part of his attempt to then give the other side of what the company is really doing. And it's not seized only with the matter of correctional services.
Now, as the person who had initiated this was Mr. Compeller, am I right?
That's correct?
Now, why did it then come to you that you take over and start facilitating the meetings between the Bosasa and Mr. Smith for correctional services?
Chairperson, in the discussion, Mr. Compela said that Mr. Smith is a very stubborn person. And since I know him better, maybe I should discuss the issue with him as far as a possible visit is concerned, so that they can deal with their matters as far as the attempts that they have made in the past to make submissions, to have a meeting that proved to be fruitless. And it's from that point of view that I approached Mr. Smith and asked him if he would participate or want to be part of such a meeting. And as I've earlier indicated, he said there's a lot of problems there and this and that. And I said that's important also, just to give them a hearing. You don't need to agree with them on anything that has been done. But since the matters are ventilated, it will, if it is possible, give them, just listen to what they have to say. You don't need to work with them. You don't need to agree with them for that matter.
So you say Mr. Smith confirmed that Bosasa, there were problems with Bosasa and correctional services.
He said they were dealing with problems as far as the Bosasa correctional services issues were concerned.
And when you became what they call the chair of chairs, did you also see it in the minutes of the portfolios of the correctional services that there were problems that were being raised in that portfolio committee regarding Bosasa and correctional services?
Chairperson, it was common knowledge at the time that when I became the chairperson of committees, that there were issues in corrections, because it was not only them who were dealing with the matter. I know at the time the Standing Committee on Public Accounts also had certain issues that they raised as far as the Bosasa Correctional Services matter is concerned.
You know, one of the aspects about the purpose of the visit that strikes me is that from your affidavit, I get the impression that you and Mr. Compella traveled all the way from Cape Town to Gauteng, to the Bosasa offices, to deal with sports issues, or to see their, I don't know, youth center or whatever, but you were coming about sports. And according to your affidavit, I think you wanted to see what facilities, the sport facilities they had for the youngsters. But having arrived at Bosasa, I think on your version, there are no facilities to be shown, and you'll just tell me if I'm misunderstanding what you have said in your affidavit. And I get the impression that Mr. Kompela wasn't too impressed with the fact that now there were no facilities to be shown. But Mr. Agrizi says, no, but we, in effect, as I understand him, could never have been, the arrangement could never have been about us showing him any sports facilities, because in that place, that center, I don't know whether the whole place or the place around where the center is tarred. There would be no facilities. So that strikes me as strange, as if, how could you have come all the way, made such a trip, if no proper homework had been made as to what you could see and what you could not see? That seemed strange to me. And yet, when you look at Mr. Agrizi's version, which starts from saying, we had been wanting to influence the Portfolio Committee on Correctional Services. We have been wanting to meet with the chairperson of the Portfolio Committee on Correctional Services, Mr. Smith. He was ignoring us. He didn't want to meet us, and they were getting negative publicity. We wanted to have somebody, we wanted the chairperson to protect Bosasa interest in when matters come up in the Portfolio Committee on Correctional Services. So when we had this stalemate, we had to find somebody else to help us access Mr. Smith. And then Mr. Frolick was the person that we got. He came to Bosasa. This was the purpose. And then it transpired that during that visit, if I recall correctly, there definitely was a discussion about the challenges that Bosasa said they were having in accessing the chairperson of the Portfolio Committee. So that issue was discussed, and it transpires that subsequently you spoke to Mr. Smith, and indeed there was ultimately a meeting, and according to Mr. Agrizi's version, indeed, in due course, there was a change of attitude on the part of Mr. Smith towards Bosasa. So there is that part. So I just want you to comment on this, starting with the question of how could you and Mr. Kompela come all the way to see sports facilities if there were no sports facilities? Had there not been a discussion before? Because if one looks at what you say was discussed during that visit, and when one looks at what Mr. Agrizi says it was discussed, there is a lot of convergence. It seems to be dominated by Bosasa's concern about accessing the Portfolio Committee. Do you want to say something?
Yes, no, thank you, Chairperson. Chairperson, as I've stated, the intention of that visit, and that's why we didn't proceed with it, didn't proceed with the visit, because they wanted to take us on something like a 4-hour thing of the entire complex and whatever they're doing there. And we said, but where's the issue then of the youth center? And they said they were not ready with it. Right? And it was not about, as Mr. Agrizi stated, rugby. As I've stated, Mr. Watson spoke about soccer, football being there, and other recreational activities that they're trying to introduce. So our purpose was specifically that. And it's because of that reason that we did not proceed in going ahead with that visit. Because it had also the element in it that you can't just then walk into an entire setup that is there for 4 hours and you don't come to the youth center that the primary purpose of it was. and that the youth center is not, they're not ready to scale down the visit at least, just to include that. That was the intention of our visit.
But can you understand my
I follow what you're saying,
concern to say
Chairperson. I follow.
you come all the way and then the purpose of the visit is defeated in a way because what you are looking for is not there. And I guess most people would be upset to say, why did you bring us here if you don't have A, B, C, D, because that's what we are interested in. Could it be that you and Mr. Kompela might have had a different purpose of the visit? Your purpose of the visit might have been different from the purpose of the visit of Bosasa, Governor Watson, and Mr. Agrizi, maybe. And maybe they were focused on seeing how you could help them resolve their challenges with Mr. Smith, while you might have gone there for something else.
Chairperson, as I said, that the reason why we visited was to focus on the youth center that we were told about, that is there operating so well. They're doing such excellent work. And maybe I don't want to speculate on behalf of Mr. Agrizi and the late Mr. Watson. Maybe they had also an intention to share with us the other difficulties that they may be experiencing as far as their company is concerned.
Yeah.
But that was not our intention. To go
Yes.
there.
Okay. Mr. Notch.
What is also interesting is that Mr. Agrizi recalls the conversation you had with them regarding access to Mr. Smith. You agree with me?
I can't agree with that, Chairperson, because if Mr. Agrizi was not part of what we were discussing inside the office, how can Mr. Agrizi then have a recollection of that, and how can I agree with that? I don't know what the discussions were between whoever were left there after we left, so I don't agree with that.
No, so sorry, I did,
Maybe I misunderstood you,
yeah, perhaps
sir.
I didn't come out clear. He states, he tells the commission about what was discussed between you and Mr. Gavin Watson regarding the difficulty to get access to Mr. Smith. He testifies about that.
Well, Chairperson, I was not part of those discussions that took place, so I can't attest to that.
No, sorry, perhaps you don't understand. Mr. Agrizi says, Mr. Watson told you that they had a problem to talk to Mr. Smith. You recall that in his affidavit?
Yes?
So I'm saying he is testifying about what Mr. Gavin Watson said to you at the meeting.
Chairperson, as I said, and I clearly indicated to this commission what our intents and purpose were for that, and also then, subsequently to what we were discussing, that he mentioned the difficulties that he had. And I also said that Mr. Agrizi was not part of those discussions. So I don't know what discussions Mr. Watson had subsequently with Mr. Agrizi.
I think what Mr. Noche seeks to check with you is whether Mr. Agrizi's information, irrespective of whether he was present at that meeting or not, whether his information that Mr. Watson raised this issue with you is correct, namely the issue of their challenges to try and get hold of to have a meeting with Mr. Smith.
Chairperson, it can only be that Mr. Watson had that discussion with Mr. Agrizi and shared with him what we were discussing amongst ourselves. And that's probably where Mr. Agrizi got his information from.
Yes, no, but the question is it correct? Is it true that during that meeting, Mr. Watson raised the issue with you?
That's correct.
That is correct.
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay.
That's correct.
And you're saying that Mr. Agrizi could have known about that discussion because Mr. Gavin Watson shared it with him. Am I right?
The only way that he could have known about the discussion, I don't know where else he could have heard
Yeah.
from it.
Unless,
Because we were not part of the discussion at any stage with Mr. Agrizzi.
unless he was in the meeting. It's either he heard it from someone or he was in the meeting.
He was not in the meeting, Chairperson. He must have heard it from someone.
Tell me, are you moving from saying, remember when you started your evidence, you say, well, you cannot recall whether he was there or not. Now you are saying you definitely was not there.
Chairperson, as I've stated earlier, this is my recollection of events that occurred way back in 2010, right? And I am saying that as far as my recollection, or recall, for the lack of a better word, is Mr. Agrizzi was not part of our discussions.
No, what
No, he was
jolted,
not part of the meeting.
what jolted your memory to say that definitely Mr. Agrizzi was not there when you started by saying, as far as your memory is concerned?
Chairperson,
Well, I think it's true that he certainly was saying earlier a number of times, it's, as far as he can recall, Mr. Agrizzi wasn't there. And then at a certain time, just 2 minutes ago, he said Mr. Agrizzi was not there.
Yes.
And then you asked a further question, then he went back to saying, as far as he recalls. I take that to mean your actual position is that you can't recall. Am I right?
Chairperson, as far as my recollection goes,
Yeah, he was not there.
as far as I recall, he
Yeah.
was not there.
And then you said, unless there's some concrete evidence to support Mr. Agrizzi's evidence, am I right, that he was there?
That's correct, Chairperson.
And what Mr. Agrizzi has done is to tell the the commission about the conversation that occurred in that room, and you confirm that conversation did occur.
But Chairperson, as I've indicated, that he could have only heard it from someone else. He could have only heard it from somewhere else. Because if my recollection is that he was not there, then he must have heard it from Mr. Gavin Watson.
And you'll agree with me that there are two scenarios, situations. You could have heard it from someone else or he was there.
Can you just repeat the question?
You say you'll agree with me. There are two scenarios. It's either he heard from someone else or he was there, he heard it himself.
Chairperson, my scenario is that as far as my recollection goes, Mr. Agrizzi was not part of the discussion or in the meeting.
Yes,
That
I
other
think,
scenario,
Yeah.
excuse me, my apologies.
I think your answer would be in line with what Mr. Nocha is saying, because you say, as far as you recall, he was not there. But you are not saying you are 100% sure that he was not there, because you say it's been a long time, but as far as I recall, he wasn't there. So I think your answer would be, if your version is correct, that if your recollection is correct, that he wasn't there, then the only other way he could have got the information is if somebody else told him. But if your recollection is wrong, then he could also have got the information because he was there, but your recollection that he was not there.
That's correct, Chairperson.
That would be your answer.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Now, excuse me. You said you have visited on a number of occasions the house of Valence Watson. Am I right?
That's correct.
And you have walked around his house, am I right?
Chairperson, when I arrive at even if my friends' houses, I don't walk around in the houses. I move from the reception door to the lounge area, wherever you're going to sit. So that is how I know the house of Mr. Watson.
And did you notice that he has a gym which is not used there?
No, Chairperson. I'm not aware of a gym.
Is that at Mr. Valence
Valence's-
Watson's house?
Yes. Now,
Well, that's important because I think you said earlier on, Mr. Frolick, you have been to Mr. Valence Watson's house a number of times. And Mr. Agrizi said that on the day that he went to Mr. Valence's house, on the occasion when he took with him some money that was meant for you, which he says he gave to Mr. Valence Watson, and Mr. Valence Watson gave it to you in his presence. He says that Mr. Valence Watson showed him a gym in the, well, I don't know whether in the house or in the premises that was not being used or had not been used for some time. So are you saying, despite the fact that you have been to that house many times, you don't know whether there is such a gym, or are you saying you know that there is no such gym?
I'm not
Or
aware.
at least there was no such gym at the time?
Chairperson, as far as I know, is that it's quite a big house that Mr. Valence Watson is staying in. And unlike the courtesy that was extended to Mr. Agrizi to show him a gym, I've never seen a gym there. I was not shown, so I'm not aware of any gyms in the
Yes.
premises.
So you don't know whether there is or
I
there
don't know.
isn't? Yeah.
I don't know.
Okay. All right.
now, does he have, so you must have seen this, does he have a beautiful brown lounge suite in his house, Mr. Watson? You must have sat on it.
Chairperson, as far as my recollection goes, Mr. Watson has a lounge suite. Now, whether it is beautiful or not, I don't know. I can't say it.
Yeah.
But look,
I
in
can
line with what you said earlier, that when you wanted to take the glory from me about being pretty, when you said the beauty lies in the eyes of the beholder, let's leave the beauty. Does he have a brown lounge suite?
As far as my recollection goes, Chairperson of the House of Mr. Watson, and the area to where he is, there is a lounge suite that is brown in color.
Mm.
That is what I know.
Yes.
There is a lounge suite
With a brown color.
with a brown color.
Okay. Okay.
Does he have-
The suburb, the name of the suburb, Mr. Nochet, do you want to cover that?
Yes.
Because he should know the name of the suburb at least.
Yes. The suburb is
I think Mr. Agrizi gives the name of the
as
suburb.
Waverley.
Is that where Mr. Valence Watson's house is?
Chairperson, I beg your indulgence to say that the area that I know the house of Mr. Valence Watson is in fact Mill Park
Yes.
in Port Elizabeth.
Not Waverley.
I don't know an area called Waverley in
Is
Port
that so?
Elizabeth.
Okay.
There's no residential area.
And you
called-
are familiar with the suburbs in that part of Port Elizabeth?
Well, Chairperson, as far as Mr. Watson's house is concerned, that
Yeah.
area there,
Yes.
that is,
So you would say certainly the area where Mr. Valence Watson's house is not called, is it Waverley?
Waverley, yes.
It's not called Waverley.
Yes.
Yes.
I know it is. I know the area, the suburb that Mr. Watson stays as Mill Park.
Yes, okay. Thank you.
Does he have where there's this lounge? I don't want to say it's beautiful. You don't like the word. Does he have Persian carpets?
Chairperson, I don't know what the Persian carpet, what is meant. I know there's carpets in his house, whether it's Persian or not. I know there's carpets in Mr. Watson's house. Part of the house is carpet.
Okay. Now let's deal with the visit of Mr. Agrizi and meeting you at Valence's house. On page 41 of the record, paragraph 33, again you use your famous word. You say, I do not recall a meeting with Mr. Agrizi at the house of Valence Watson. You see that?
Yes.
So does this again mean it could have happened, but you cannot remember now?
Chairperson, as I have stated, I've been to that house of Mr. Watson numerous times. And I cannot recall being in a meeting with Mr. Agrizi. in Mr. Watson's house. Once again, taking into account that this happened. In fact, I don't even know what the date of the meeting is. What year it is that Mr. Agritzi is referred. Maybe you can assist me if you have that information. What date it is that this meeting took place and also the time that the meeting took place. And that can possibly assist me. But just to say that there was a meeting and this and that, I cannot recall the version that Mr. Agritzi gave.
Now, what is important here, Mr. Frolick, is this. You do not deny, don't say I never met an aggressor. Remember, by the time you deposed to this affidavit, you had now seen Mr. Aggressor, am I right?
Yes,
You saw him in Parliament, am I right?
yes,
You saw him on TV, am I right?
yes,
Now, by the time you deposed to this affidavit, you knew the face that was talking, that was saying it met you at Valance Watson's house. You say you cannot recall whether you met that face there or not. Is that your evidence?
that is my evidence, Chairperson. I cannot recall that. And as I've said, if I could get more particulars and specifics, Mr. Agritzi, if he says it happened, then he must have details of that visit as to when it happened. And that is my best recollection of what I have as far as that statement of his is concerned.
Now, I see that you are enthusiastic in checking people who are mentioned to have been involved with you. You checked with Mr. Compella. You checked with Mr. Chigi Watson. Did you check with Mr. Valance Watson about this?
I checked with Mr. Watson.
What did he say?
Mr. Watson also cannot recall such a meeting taking place. He said no. But I asked him and he said no, he can't remember that.
But he does not deny it.
His direct words was that he can't remember such a meeting taking place.
So you're saying he didn't deny it. He just says he cannot recall.
He simply said that he cannot remember such a meeting taking place. He said to me when I asked him, he said there's people coming in and out of his house who are working for his brother or whenever they're in PE or whatever. So he said he cannot recall this specific instance that is being referred to here.
Now, Mr. Agrizi's evidence is this, that this was not just a social visit. He came with money to be given to you. Am I right? That's what his evidence is.
That's what he says, yes.
Yes. And Mr. Watson says he cannot recall this. He doesn't deny it, but he says he cannot recall this. That's
Chairperson,
strange.
Chairperson, as far as I know, and even when this money thing is concerned, I've never received money from what Mr. Agrizi is referring to here, from Mr. Watson, even if there's other people there or not. I've not received that. Mr. Watson simply said, and I'm going to use his direct words, if I may. He says, Angel is talking nonsense. That was his direct words, because I asked him, this man says I got money from you in a meeting that he was in, and he said no. He said no.
He says no, he can't recall.
He says no.
No what?
He simply says no. He never ever passed money on to me in the way that is being referred to here by Mr. Agrizi. It didn't happen. Right? As far as meetings and things are concerned, he says he can't even recall that taking place.
Tell me, did he refuse to give you a confirmatory affidavit, as others did? The others did give you. Did he refuse to give you?
I did not request any confirmatory affidavit from Mr. Valance Watson, Chairperson. Maybe if Mr. Valance Watson is requested to make available an affidavit, you can find it out.
Why did you not ask him? You had asked others.
Mr. Valance Watson, when I discussed these matters with him as a family, they are very upset with the fact that firstly their brother, Gavin Watson, died under mysterious circumstances. And they have a particular view. And I don't share easily into what they discuss as a family. I'm not involved in those type of discussions, but you can see whenever the situation is, he gets angry, he's very upset and he's agitated with the allegations that Mr. Agrizi is making.
And I suppose under those circumstances, you would have easily given you a confirmatory affidavit if you had asked for one. Sorry.
I didn't request any confirmatory affidavit from him, Chairperson. I asked him actually, what is your view in terms of interacting with, because it's mentioned, a lot of things are being said or whatever, and he simply said to me they're still consulting with their legal advisors on the matter. And given that answer, Advocate Noche, I didn't pursue the matter any further. Because if he says they are consulting as a family on the matter with their attorneys, then I can't enter into the space to say, give me then a confirmatory affidavit.
But you managed to get it from Chiki Watson, the brother, the family as well.
Chairperson, I don't want to go into the dynamics of that family, which is quite a sensitive issue. Yes, they are brothers, but the levels of interaction is completely different from one another. I don't want to go into that. They will be in a better position to explain that.
I understand. Because Mr. Grizzly seems to have a clear recollection of what happened. Turn to page 50. Look at paragraph 24. 24.1, I want to read it for you. It says, I confirm that I did meet with Mr. Cedric Frolick at Mr. Valance Watson's house, and we joked about the beautiful brown lounge suite and Persian carpets, and we stated that we wouldn't be able to afford such items. This is evidence of someone, doesn't say, I just saw you, he says, I interacted with Mr. Frolick. We spoke and we joked about things. And you say you can't remember this?
I don't remember that, Chairperson. That is the version of Mr. Agrizzi. For whatever reason he's mentioning it in that way, I cannot remember that.
Now, I read in your affidavit, you say that it's strange that Mr. Agrizzi says he gave the money to Mr. Watson and then Mr. Watson gave it to you. And you're asking, why didn't Mr. Agrizzi just say, give the money to you? Am I right?
That's correct.
And am I correct to say that if Mr. Agrizzi was making up the story, it would have been easy for him to say, well, I got in the money and then I gave it to him. He wouldn't create all this, giving the money to someone to give it to you. Am I right?
That's also what I question, Chairperson, in terms of the version of events, as Mr. Agrizzi said. Logic tells me, if that you coming there with this load of money that you give to somebody, why would you give it to someone else and then that one gives it to someone else? But that's I simply, in terms of what I state in my affidavit, say that it doesn't make sense.
The one possibility, at least that I can think of, is that if Mr. Gavin Watson had given him the money on the basis that he should give it to Mr. Valance Watson for Mr. Valance Watson to pass it on to you, maybe he wouldn't want to give it directly to you. Say, I'm giving it to the person that I was told I must give to, but he must give it to Mr. Frolick. That's the only thing I can think of.
My view is quite different.
Yes, no.
I understand what you're saying.
I'm just saying a possibility.
Yes.
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 It may be that somebody else will say, well, there's no need for the money to go via Valance Watson. We are all here. Here is the money. So that's possible as well.
And that's what I was putting to you, that wouldn't Mr. Agrizzi's story, if he was creating it, be more simple? He says, well, I got there, I gave the money to Mr. Frolick, rather than creating this long route.
Well, my view, Chairperson, is that I struggle to follow why Mr. Agrizzi would come to this type of conclusion around money that was passed from one person to the other side. I don't know what his thinking is in terms of what he has put to the Commission because I share a completely different perspective in terms of the approach of this thing.
I think what Mr. Noche is suggesting to you is, look, if Mr. Agrizi was fabricating all of this and wanted to falsely frame you in corruption, would it not be an easier thing for him to say, we met in Mr. Valens Watson's house, Mr. Frolick was there, and I handed him the money and he took it from me. So in other words, I can testify positively, I gave it to him, as opposed to saying I gave it to somebody else for that person to give it to him. So he is saying, wouldn't that be an easier thing for somebody who wants to frame you rather than talk about this version of giving it to somebody else?
No, I follow what
You follow what he's saying,
Advocate
yes.
Noche
Yes.
is
Okay,
bringing
okay.
to the fore.
Yes.
But
You say it didn't happen.
it didn't happen.
Yeah.
And his evidence, perhaps then it can tie in with what you had been asking for. His evidence says this: within a week after you've been given money, you managed to arrange a meeting with Mr. Vincent Smith.
Chairperson, that's not as I recall the evidence. What do you say it was? About 10 days after the meeting at Bosasa's offices, this incident happened in Port Elizabeth. That's what he said, with respect.
Okay. I can't recall, Mr. Noche.
On page 26, starting from paragraph 70. He says, this is the evidence of Mr. Agrizi. He says, I gave the package of cash to Valence Watson, who later gave it to Cedric Frolick as we left the house. Within a week of meeting within a week of the meeting, Gavin Watson received a call from Cedric Frolick. Gavin Watson told me that I was to accompany Captain Jenje on an introductory meeting with Vincent Smith. There it is.
I stand corrected, Mr. Chairman.
No, thank you.
So what is the question,
The
Advocate?
question is, he says within a week after I met you, you had then arranged a meeting to see that they see Mr. Frolick, to Mr. Vincent Smith.
No, I don't agree. I don't agree with that, Chairperson. If I must go back
Yes.
to after the meeting that took place, Chairperson, at Bosasa, is that we returned to Cape Town. I returned to Cape Town personally. It was in Cape Town because we had duties to fulfill there. And it was during that period that I had the interaction with Mr. Smith. This thing of a meeting in Port Elizabeth at Mr. Valence Watson's house, I don't know where it fits in or where it comes in. And that's why I say that maybe since Mr. Agrizi kept such meticulous record of the gym and furniture in the house and all of that, then surely he must know the date that this meeting took place in Port Elizabeth.
Is it not so? Sorry. No, continue. I beg your pardon.
No. So I don't understand where this meeting fits into after the engagement from.
Yeah, because the date, no date is
There's
given,
no
or
date.
time frame.
But are you not able, when you try to jot your memory, to think about when Mr. Smith agreed? Because you said Mr. Smith is a very busy person. Now, at some stage, he agreed to meet them. But then, can you think back a week before that and think where you were The week before that.
It's long ago, Chairperson, but this type of incident that is referred to here, it would have assisted me if the specifics were available. Because I know I was in Cape Town, and it was within probably 2 weeks after being to the office there that Mr. Agrizzi and that's the first time, by the way, that I met him. Mr. Njenje came to Cape Town, and I don't know where this fits in. And that's why I say, give me more details. But I can definitely say, sir, that...
So I think that your evidence will not be to deny having facilitated a meeting between Bosasa and Mr. Vincent Smith.
That's correct.
Which is what Mr. Agrizzi also says. I think the difference between your version in relation to facilitating the meeting and Mr. Agrizzi's version is that Mr. Agrizzi says the facilitation came about because they had started giving you money, whereas you are saying, yes, I did facilitate, but it was not because of any money that I had received. Am I right in
That's
putting
my
that
submission,
way?
Chairperson.
Yes.
And that's why, with respect, that's why I say this episode now of Port Elizabeth
Yes.
and Waverley coming in,
Yes.
I really cannot remember that, sir.
Now, but your sorry, your version, responding to the chairperson, is this that, okay, before I do that, we know at the time you were not in the portfolio committee for Justice and Correctional Services.
Yes.
And you just came to be involved in this Bosasa Correctional Services because you accompanied Mr. Puti Kompela to the Bosasa complex, right? And then so far as you were concerned, you were just helping Mr. Gavin Watson, whom you had seen, whom you knew, to meet Mr. Smith, am I right?
Yes.
And thereafter, you had no reason to be involved with Bosasa and their problems with the portfolio committee. It was not your committee.
No, Chairperson, as I said earlier, I've never served on that committee. Never ever served on that committee. And after that visit that took place, and I think Mr. Agrizzi also, if I'm not mistaken, in his verbal evidence that he gave, is when they reported back to Mr. Watson that they were not happy with the outcome of the discussion. And after that, I had no reason to be further interested in the matter as it is, as that specific matter is. Not meaning that I ceased my friendship with Mr. Watson and his brothers and all of that. The friendship still continued. And even up to today, we are friends.
Now, when did you again discuss the Bosasa issue with Mr. Watson, Kevin Watson? After the visit to the Parliament?
After the visit to Parliament, and Mr. Kevin Watson was not part of it, he called me and he said to me, he heard that the meeting didn't go well. His guys said they just left, nothing happened. And that was the time when he called me to say that it didn't work. They tried to engage, or have a discussion with the chairperson of that committee, but it didn't work. That was basically almost, I think, if I can remember well, almost on the same day or the following day.
And that was it?
That was it.
And you never spoke to him about Bosasa?
No, and you know what, Chairperson, I think, and I want to make use of this opportunity, of the type of person that the late Gavin Watson was. A very persistent person. Very persistent person, probably. That's why I got involved in business and things like that. But Mr. Watson always had a passion for what he was doing. And he believed in what he was doing and the way that he was doing. So that even on occasion when you discuss the broader politics, of which he followed in the ANC, and he would call you and he will come and he talk about this or that, or when the sports situation in the Eastern Cape unraveled and didn't work out, he would speak to me, call me, speak to me and say, but you know what, why you guys, because at one stage I left Eastern Province Rugby, I resigned, I think it was 2014-15, I left the union. He said, but why don't you speak to Chiki as well? So that he can also leave this thing, because that thing is never going to work. But he would continuously say that he's getting a raw deal in terms of his business operations, and he doesn't know why he's treated like that. He is an ANC member, and he is a supporter of the African National Congress. So he raised it afterwards. He'll come continuously back to it. But then, at the point, then you tell him, but listen here, I can't assist you with that. I can give you an opinion or view, but more than that I cannot do, because that is not my area of operation. As a friend, I can advise you, but in terms of the dealings of what is happening in there, I can't share any information with you that I don't have, because I don't serve in that capacity. And even having been the chairperson of the committees, Chief Justice, we don't get involved. The rules of Parliament says the committees, they follow their own programs. They do whatever they do. They report on those matters. And Advocate Noche referred earlier to minutes. He referred to minutes of meetings. I don't read minutes of committee meetings. That is something, because if you read minutes of a meeting that you were not part of, what are you trying to achieve? So I don't read it. I oversee and work with 38, at least chairpersons, who's dealing with various things. And the forum where they discuss minutes and where they deal with their issues is in the portfolio committees. So I would simply, when Mr. Watson would, whether it's about elections that he's talking, internal issues in the ANC, and whenever he wants to bring up the issue of this bad treatment that he's getting, then I would say, well, that is something you must deal with. That is something, and if there's legal issues involved, pursue the legal routes.
No.
I see we are at 1:02. I propose, if everyone agrees, that we continue, because I suspect that we should be able to be done by 2:00,
We should be,
and then we adjourn for the day. Would that suit everybody?
Yes, Chair, especially Mr. Frolick, he had made a special request that he try and finish him early. He had to
Yes.
go back. And no,
Yes.
that suits me very
Yeah,
well.
Mr. Van Zyl also indicates he's happy with that. Okay, let's continue then.
Chairperson, with respect, is it possible just to
Or to have a...
answer a call from nature?
Yeah, okay. Let's take a, 10 minutes
No,
break?
even shorter, Chairperson, really,
Yeah.
it's up to you.
Okay, let's say 10 minutes.
Okay.
We adjourn.